What is the difference between the rogue's sneak attack and the barbarian's reckless attack when it comes to gameplay incentivization? To answer that question, we need to dig into what it is to incentivize certain gameplay within a tabletop role-playing game. Now, this is going to be a nuanced subject, and before we dig into it, I recommend you check out last week's video where I talk about culture of play versus rules as written, as we're going to use some of the terms defined there. All right, let's dig into it. So this gameplay incentivization is when the rules explain to you the appropriate way or the intended way they want you to play the game, or to play a particular class or use a particular ability. It's how the game tries to guide you into that intended space. The two primary ways this happens in a role-playing game is, one, in a preamble to either the book itself or to a section of the book, or two, gameplay systems that try to nudge the player into a particular cultural practice at the table. So let's look at some examples of preambles in role-playing game books. First, let's look at the D&D 5.5 Player's Handbook. In it, it says that the Dungeon Master creates adventures for the player characters who navigate its hazards and decide which paths to explore. The DM also narrates what they experience and plays the friends and foes they meet along the way. Even though the DM challenges the adventurers, the DM always strives to delight the whole group. For players, it says that working together, the group might explore a dark dungeon, a ruined city, a haunted castle, a lost temple, a lava-filled mountain, or another location described by the DM. The adventurers also solve puzzles, talk with other characters, battle fantastic monsters, and discover magic items and other treasure, all while supporting each other's fun. And lastly, it says on a subsequent page, the DM guides your party's journey as your characters become more powerful. So this is painting a very particular picture of what a Dungeons & Dragons game is supposed to be. It's high fantasy, it's high adventure, it's delightful, it's fun, you support each other, and you grow more powerful over time. It's painting a very classic picture that all of us are very familiar with and probably wouldn't need to read. So that tells us what the designers of this game have intended us to interpret when we read these rules. It's how they imagine the players will interact with this rule system. And as we flip through the pages and pages of content, it should be coloring that interpretation. Now, of course, that's not to say that you have to play D&D in that manner, as is in the Culture of Play video, but it's giving us an insight into how they think the game should be played. Now let's juxtapose this with Blades in the Dark. To read from the very first page, Blades in the Dark is a game about a group of daring scoundrels building a criminal enterprise on the haunted streets of an industrial fantasy city. There are heists, chases, escapes, dangerous bargains, bloody skirmishes, deceptions, betrayals, victories, and deaths. We play to find out if the fledgling crew can thrive amidst the teeming threats of rival gangs, powerful noble families, vengeful ghosts, the blue coats of the City Watch, and the siren song of the scoundrels' own vices. Now you can see we're already off to a different start than the D&D book. And now you could spend a lot of time talking about all the very smart decisions that John Harper made when creating this rulebook, but just to highlight one more, on page 6 of the Blades in the Dark book, it actually tells you who gets to make the judgment calls in various rules situations. For example, which actions are reasonable as a solution to a problem is decided by the players. How dangerous and effective a given action is in those circumstances is decided by the GM, and it goes on to list various other examples and situations, clearly stating who should have final say in those situations. And that it should always be a conversation, of course, but at the end of the day, certain things are under the player's purview and certain things are under the GM's purview. And that clear delineation tells you how to proceed and run the game. And juxtapose the Game Master recommendation here with the one in D&D. In this one it says, the GM helps organize the conversation of the game so it's pointed toward the interesting elements of play. The GM isn't in charge of the story and doesn't have to plan events ahead of time. They present interesting opportunities to the players, then follow the chain of action and consequences wherever they lead. You can see that this is leaving it much open to improvisation and a mutual contribution to the story. And that's a very different way to set up how you want the players to read your rulebook and parse through your rules. Another form of preamble, or we could say meta rule, is the idea of things like the rule of cool. And I assume most people watching this are familiar with the rule of cool, but long story short, it's the idea that if something is just sufficiently awesome, you should allow it to function. You should be interpreting the rules in such a way as to facilitate awesome, cool moments, regardless of the internal logic or consistency within the rules themselves. It itself, the rule of cool, is an unofficial meta rule that encapsulates the rest of the system. And you can see how the rule of cool aligns with the preamble we saw in the D&D 5.5 handbook, where it wants to delight and tell epic stories of progression of power and for us to do it together as a team and support each other. So you can see how the rule of cool is really in line with that ideology. But there could be other ideologies in a rulebook too. For example, in Tales from Elsewhere, we have the rule of cruel, and this is a meta rule that tells you how to interpret the rest of the rules that follow thereafter. The rule of cruel says whenever there's a discrepancy or a disagreement about how to proceed with a rule, you ask yourself this question: what would be the most gnarly, destructive, deadly, and chaos-inducing interpretation of those rules? That's the one you go with. Because Tales from Elsewhere games are not facilitating the same atmosphere as a D&D game. Because in Tales from Elsewhere, the job of the storyteller, what we call a GM in that system, isn't to facilitate delight. It's to weave a tale of terror and nightmare and violence that the players need to survive. It is more like trying to present a horror movie experience to the players that they will have the fun of trying to make it out with life and limb intact. And the rule of cruel is a way to facilitate that sort of gameplay, rather than a heroic fantasy one. Let's juxtapose all three of those games with the absolutely hilarious game Peasantry. There's a free demo for this you can download right now. It's made by this designer named Zachary. He is awesome. This game is hilarious. I've played multiple sessions of it. Highly recommend checking it out. Here is what the preamble says in that book. Peasantry is a game about grubby, nasty peasants and the messes they make. Infused with a sense of exaggerated humor, this TTRPG is designed for you and your friends to create silly and over-the-top one-shot adventures about commoners and the chaos they create. Amidst the chaos, each peasant strives to be the filthiest and most cunning of all, even if it means betraying their comrades. Now, that reading colors your whole interpretation of the book that follows, and the book itself is just full of mayhem and hilarity. And that will guide the players right from the beginning into a certain way of behaving. The book is definitely worth reading just as an example of guiding the players toward silliness, which is not often the goal that tabletop role-playing games have at the outset. But this is a masterclass in doing so. You can't help but read the book and think, wow, this is hilarious. Now, this video isn't sponsored by Peasantry or anything like that. I'm just a fan of the game. I've run a few sessions of it myself. I've played in a session with the creator, and it's just awesome. And I'll put links to that game down below. It's just really fun, and there's a bunch of free stuff for it right now. All right, let's get back to the matter at hand. Now, like I've said over and over again, that doesn't mean you couldn't play a gritty horror game in D&D or a heroic fantasy game using a Tales from Elsewhere system, but they're not necessarily set up to do so by the designers, right? That's not their intended use of play for the game. But of course, more power to you. Use them, homebrew them, hack them however you want to play the game you want to play. So now let's look at that other way of approaching incentivized gameplay and rule interpretation. And this will help us answer that question about barbarians and rogues. We have two ways to write a rule. You have prescripted rules, and you have incentivized rules. And let's unpack those both really quickly. A prescripted rule is one that concretely tells you exactly how it works and what sort of mechanics are involved. It is something you usually switch on or activate, whether by paying a cost or using an ability slot or something like that. It tells you concretely what will happen and what the drawbacks are when you do. An incentivized rule is one that rewards the player for meeting certain criteria. You're dangling the carrot on the end of the stick for them, hoping to guide them toward a certain situation, a certain gameplay choice, a certain option in their moment-to-moment time at the table. So now we can define what Reckless Attack is. Reckless Attack is definitely a prescribed ability. It's something the player switches on. They activate this whenever they want to. They gain a benefit, which is advantage on their attack rolls, and they gain a drawback, which is enemies gaining advantage against them. So this is attempting to replicate a fantasy for the barbarian of throwing themselves headlong into battle and that, with no care to their safety. But is it doing that? Reckless attack actually is worse the more recklessly the barbarian uses it. And let me explain what I mean. If the barbarian is surrounded by 5 enemies and uses reckless attack, the incoming amount of advantage he's granting is a lot, because the barbarian's only going to maybe get a couple attacks out of this reckless attack mode themselves. They'll gain advantage on maybe 2 swings if they're about level 5, or maybe 3 if they have some feats or such that are going to give them an extra swing. But the enemies all get advantage on all their attacks against him, and if they're multi-attackers, this could rapidly go into the double digits of attacks with advantage against them. So this mechanic is asking the player to weigh the drawbacks of activating reckless attack against the benefits they'll gain. And that's not really forwarding a reckless play style. It's actually rewarding a more measured or conservative approach to combat. Now, the barbarian has a lot of features that are meant to mitigate this drawback, but a lot of them are themselves prescribed binary choices like activating rage or not. And so this ability doesn't present the barbarian player with a way to be more reckless and be rewarded for it. Now, compare that to an alternative ability in which maybe the more the barbarian is hurt, the more advantages they gain in combat. This is a structure you'll see in things like Draw Steel's Fury class, in my own Advanced Barbarian rework I did a little while ago, we'll put a link down to that, where the more damage the barbarian is taking, the more powerful they become. And that is an incentivized gameplay structure. What this means is that the barbarian player is rewarded for playing more recklessly, because the more injuries they take, the more things go wrong, the stronger they get. That's incentivizing an intended approach to gameplay. We can compare that now to the rogue sneak attack, which is an incentivization structure. Sneak attack says that if you sneak up on an enemy or you gang up on them, you'll deal extra damage. So this rewards a rogue player from fighting like a scoundrel. It tells them sneak up on your enemies or fight unfair against a foe, and you'll be rewarded. It doesn't have a mode you necessarily switch on to trigger this ability, though they have added some features that let them more easily gain access to it. But it rewards certain gameplay practices for the rogue player, which I think might be a stronger structure. And we can compare that directly to the steady aim feature on the rogue, which says that if you use a bonus action and don't move, you gain advantage on an attack roll, which would grant you sneak attack. And that's a prescripted ability. It's a thing you switch on to gain a benefit and a drawback. And it's nice that they gave the rogue both of these options, something that can incentivize gameplay and one that they can just kind of switch on at any time to avoid the weird, I hide in the shadows, jump out, shoot, step back in, repeat every round sort of gameplay. But I think that the baseline rogue sneak attack feature is a stronger narrative tool than steady aim when it comes to reinforcing certain behavioral practices. Another example of an incentivized rule system is the idea of inspiration in D&D. And now this sort of metacurrency is found in a lot of games where you get a little Benny that you can use to re-roll a failed check of some sort or do something narrative with it. And the way you gain it varies system by system. But in Dungeons & Dragons, it's gained generally by the DM thinking you did something cool, that you role-played really effectively, maybe you made the whole table laugh, just things that have enhanced the table's experience as a way to gain this inspiration. So that rule structure is supposed to incentivize to the players to be fun at the table. It's supposed to push them to have an enjoyable time and enhance the experience of everyone around them. But my personal experience with inspiration in D&D is it ends up being kind of a popularity contest. It's whoever's sense of humor just aligns the most with the DMs, or whoever they like best is going to often get more inspiration than others. And the quiet player who isn't really comfortable cracking jokes at the table, they often end up not having any of it. This form of metacurrency is a GM-facing system, or DM-facing system, and what that means is it's entirely under the control of the person running the game. They decide when that system comes into play, when they reward it to players and when they don't. The players don't really have any say in that process. They can maybe ask the DM if that is inspiration-worthy, but at the end of the day, it is entirely arbitrative on how it proceeds by the DM. So what that means is it actually incentivizes the behavior that the DM likes, whatever that behavior may be, heavy role-playing, making lots of jokes, and that's a different sort of incentivization than maybe the designers had intended. So let's look at a different way to handle that metacurrency in Tales from Elsewhere. So in Tales from Elsewhere, there's a meta currency the players can gain called luck. It functions somewhat similarly to inspiration in D&D in that you can use it to reroll things that you just failed and whatnot. But the key difference is that you can also use it to narratively modify the scene to your benefit. Examples would be remembering to have brought a lantern that you'd forgot back in the cart. You can use luck to luckily remember it. You can have any small piece of gear on you, or discover useful things, or retroactively change a scene with a minor flashback like, good thing I remembered to tie a rope off here in this cavern before we started climbing. Things like that. The biggest difference with luck, though, is that you gain it via a player-facing system that rewards certain types of gameplay. Let me break it down really quick. Despite the brutality of TFE's injury system and all the maladies and conditions you can have, there's not a lot of effects that actually reduce your action economy, that take away player agency. Being frightened, being maimed, all of these things don't necessarily make you do fewer things on your turn. And that's where gaining luck comes in. Because you see, at any point in a scenario, the players can choose to gain luck by enhancing the horror and intensity of the scene, making it harder on themselves. And they can do this in a number of ways. For example, maybe you have a barbed arrow stuck in your side, and instead of fighting back during that turn or addressing the wound, you just lay on your back and cry out, "Oh God, they hit me, oh, it hurts!" And that enhances the gameplay and gives you 1 luck. The storyteller doesn't need to approve this use for you. It's just something you can do at any time. You burn a turn doing something narratively entertaining, and you gain luck. Or maybe you have the frightened condition, which normally doesn't incur any action economy penalties. So you spend your turn running behind the wagon and crying and whimpering in fear and worried that you're all gonna die. That gives you luck as well. And just as you can use luck to gain narrative advantages, retroactively changing a scene for your benefit, you can gain luck by doing the opposite, making the scene harder for yourself or more complicated, like maybe your dynamite bundle accidentally gets lit early and now you gotta toss it away, or maybe your gun jams. All of these things you can use to gain luck as well, adding to the terror and intensity of the scene. Because this system concretely incentivizes a certain culture of play at the table. It's pushing the players into behaving a certain way that will enhance the intended gameplay experience for a Tales from Elsewhere session. And so, do I think that incentivized rules are better than prescribed rules? Well, no, they serve different purposes. I do think, though, that some games tend to overemphasize prescribed gameplay structures that end up being more limited and less narratively interesting than incentivization structures. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't use both. They have their places within any game you're designing or homebrew you're creating. But I always urge you to ask, when you're designing any ability, what does that ability or feature ask the player to do? What is it rewarding them for doing at the table? And if that answer isn't in line with your goal, you should reassess what incentives there are to using the ability. And so an interesting thought experiment for you would be to flip through your favorite role-playing game, whether that's D&D 5e, Peasantry, Blades in the Dark, and see if you can categorize which abilities fall into the prescriptive or incentivized structure, and then compare that to which abilities you think are more fun. I think you'll end up finding that the incentivized ones end up opening up more interesting design imagination for you, an interesting design puzzle for you to put together at the table and in character creation than the prescribed ones. But give it a try yourself and let me know maybe what your findings are. I'm very curious if some games out there lean more heavily one direction or the other. Alright, well, that was a fairly long rant. As always, I appreciate y'all sticking it out to the end, and I hope to catch you next time on Tales from Elsewhere.